I think the private investigators that were hired to go question Jay-Z and Diddy's Jane Doe accuser might have just slipped up big time. As you know, private investigators went and questioned this Jane Doe, and they now put in another full transcript of everything this Jane Doe allegedly said in Jay-Z's extortion case against Tony Buzbee. In this private investigator's motion, she said that she was not hired by Jay-Z or Jay-Z's attorneys to perform the investigation onto this Jane Doe. A lot of us already said it made no sense that a private investigator would just randomly somehow find this Jane Doe, then go question her only about Jay-Z, and then it would come back and be used as evidence in his extortion case. Remember, Alex Spiro, Jay-Z's lawyer, said in the Good Morning America interview that he did, where he took the Jane Doe's clip and played it, that somebody close to Jay-Z is the one that wanted this investigation done. But that really doesn't make sense, because in a court filing that they filed before all of this information dropped, they said that Doe has now voluntarily admitted directly to representatives of Mr. Carter. And in this new full transcript that these private investigators dropped with this conversation with this Jane Doe, I think that they slipped up not once but twice, because the Jane Doe asked if they were hired by Jay-Z, and what they say is pretty sketchy. And also, they give the full name of this other private investigator that was with the other one, and you guys are going to be shocked to see who this man is. In this full transcript of this message that this Jane Doe had with the private investigators, they kept saying that they were not here to hurt you or anything. We just want to talk, which would honestly make me terrified if some random people that aren't supposed to know me show up on my door, and one of the first things that they are saying is they're not going to hurt you. We'll read this whole transcript in a minute, because I want to get into the name of this other private investigator. In this new transcript of the call, his full name was released, and his name is James Robert Butler. And mind you, in his affidavit, he did not say that he was not hired by Jay-Z or his counsel. I went and did some digging, as you guys know I do, and I found a man with the same name, James Robert Butler, who worked for the New York Police Department in Manhattan, and he was a detective. And then it says right now that he's still active in the police department, but in a different bureau, which is Richmond. So it made me think of the private investigators that went around questioning content creators if they were paid to talk about a celebrity's connection to Diddy. And as you know, my friend Samson over on TikTok actually caught this interaction in real time. And this man right here was wearing a hat with a thin blue line, and they also had a very thick New York accent. And then around the same time, Tony Buzbee was posting how there were private investigators going after his former and current clients, trying to persuade them to give them money to file fake lawsuits against him. And Tony Buzbee actually has 3 different lawsuits filed against Roc Nation, Quinn Emanuel, and Marcy Croft, alleging that they are behind this. And I said this man looked very similar to the one man that was going around questioning content creators, which is why I think that these private investigators didn't want to say that they were hired by Jay-Z or his counsel. These 2 private investigators at the time did not want to give any information about who they were hired for. They said that the person that they are being hired by didn't want their information out there.
You guys are private investigators who have come to my private home asking about influencers? Correct. This is very uncomfortable, you guys.
I don't know why. I'll explain.
No, you're at my home.
Okay, so you don't want to talk to us then?
Have I broken some law?
Absolutely not.
And you have the thin blue, this is frightening. I think, can you guys step away from my home?
Well, we're in a public street, so the answer is no. But we're not trying to give you a hard time.
Why are you here? What do you mean? You're showing up at my house.
We're very nice and respectful, and we will be. I just have 2 quick questions for you, and if you want to be interested in it, great. If not, I'll have a nice day. We're not...
What is this? This is odd.
So...
You have to admit this is very weird.
It always is, and people always ask us the same question. I'm happy to explain to you. So
what?
Very simply, we were just hired to speak to a few people that do, have a lot of followers and stuff like that on different platforms.
What, is this about the Diddy stuff I report on?
Somewhat, yes. Not necessarily Diddy stuff, but, people are involved and just stuff like that. So basically, a very simple question is are you paid to influence that's stories like that in any direction?
No, not at all.
Which, mind you, These creators live in Los Angeles, California, and it's actually illegal for private investigators not to show identification. But they did give their names, and one was very similar to this private investigator that went and questioned this Jane Doe.
Can I get your guys' information just so if I have something that comes up, I can contact you guys?
So to be honest, like,
No?
you can't give out a company because
Okay.
they don't want to be linked to anybody.
Got it.
My name is Robert James.
Okay, Robert.
Peter Deegan.
Okay,
And
cool.
very
This is
simply,
crazy.
Now that's crazy. That man just admitted that his name was Robert James, and this private investigator's name is James Robert Butler. James Robert Butler is a police detective in the New York Police Department, which I find pretty odd because Alex Spiro is based in New York. It's just my opinion on that, but that's pretty weird. Then it ties in even more. So the same private investigators contacted a woman named Amala, who is a YouTube creator, and were asking her the same type of questions as they asked Sampson, and she was able to confirm that these were the same private investigators. And she said they told her the same names, but they also told her that they were retired police detectives from New York.
Again, they don't explain who they're working for, so I'm asking them again, who hired you to be here? Who is the one who is making sure that you're at my door right now asking, not my door, but a door that I used to live at, asking these questions? They won't say who. Then I'm saying, okay, if you guys are private investigators, what is the name of your LLC or what is the name of your corporation? Give me that, because you're willing to own up to the fact that you're being private investigators. Which company is this person paying to? They won't say. They even go as far as to say, we don't have an LLC and we don't have a corporation. Whoever their client is paying them directly to their name. The whole conversation ended somewhat amicably. I said, you know what? Forgive me for being hostile, but I have no idea who you are or what you're doing or what pretenses you are coming to this person's door under, and I need that information. And they just essentially said, oh, you're not going to hear anything more from us. We're investigators. We're former law enforcement. You know, apparently they're from New York, and now that they've gotten this information from me, I'm never going to see them again, and that's it.
Which is why I say these private investigators might have just slipped up big time, because if Tony Buzbee is able to prove that the one private investigator that was going to question that Jane Doe and saying that he wasn't hired by Jay-Z or his counsel is the same private investigator that was with this private investigator that Tony Buzbee caught on camera and allegedly on tape trying to bribe his former clients to sue him, and he has 3 lawsuits out against Roc Nation and Quinn Emanuel over that might be a huge deal. Even the way these private investigators word in this full transcript conversation with this Jane Doe about being hired by Jay-Z is honestly kind of bad. Now, the way these private investigators talk to this Jane Doe is honestly kind of messed up, but let's go ahead and get into this full transcript of the conversation. So the Jane Doe's name is still blacked out, and she says, "Hi, how can I help y'all?" And the private investigator said, "Hey, how are you?" And she said, "Good, how are you?" The private investigator said, oh, puppy, can you step out for a second? Or can you, I don't want him to bite us. Jane Doe said, oh, he doesn't bite. And then the private investigator said, oh, okay. The Jane Doe said, how can I help y'all? The male private investigator said, how's everything, with her name? And she responds, yeah. The male private investigator said, how are you doing? My name is Robert. This is Charlotte. We just came to kind of talk to you real quick, kind of run a couple things by you. We just kind of wanted to see what was going on. I know there's kind of a court case going and it's since gone away. And she said, yeah. The male private investigator said, so we're just here trying to figure out what happened with that. We're actually thinking that you might have been taken advantage of a little bit by maybe an attorney. Does that sound like something maybe like that? And she said, who are you guys? The female private investigator said, we're not here to hurt you or anything. We just want to talk. She said, how did you find out where I am? How did you find out who I am? The male private investigator said, well, based on the interview and all the paperwork that we got, it was kind of pieced together. But listen. Then the female private investigator said, You are going to remain a Jane Doe. The male private investigator said, very simple. They don't want your name to come out at all. They're kind of okay with that, with you being a Jane Doe. But obviously now that everything has been dropped, they want to clear everything and make sure, So basically, I just had a few questions. And she said, okay. The male private investigator said, hoping that, again, if you cooperate and kind of tell us what's going on, everything remains a Jane Doe. We don't want to tell anyone who you are or what's going on or nothing. She said, okay. And the private investigator said, so a couple of quick questions was, how did you end up approaching the attorney? Or did the attorney approach you? Or how did that work? She said, I saw something on Facebook. And he said, you saw a what on Facebook? And she said, an ad. She was referred to Tony Buzbee by the Ava Law Group law firm. And the Ava Law Group law firm just did an article with New York Times. And they said Andrew Van Arsendale's law firm posted ads on social media, including these AI-generated images, which drew a large response after Mr. Combs was indicted. And this matters because in this extortion lawsuit, Jay-Z is alleging that Tony Buzbee is the one that pushed this Jane Doe to name Jay-Z in this lawsuit. And the Ava Law Group actually just did an affidavit saying that this Jane Doe had already named Jay-Z at their law firm before she even got to Tony Buzbee. And they included the very heavily redacted intake form that she filled out after she saw this alleged Facebook ad to file a claim against Diddy, and it says Jay-Z, blanked out name, which I guess is the other female celebrity, and Sean Combs. Private investigator said, do you mind if we, just so that the barking, all right, I'm sorry, and the other private investigator said, it's okay. Jane Doe said, I'm just curious to how y'all found out or even figured out who I am or where I am, because they said they wouldn't release it even. The private investigator then said, so they kind of didn't, but just in the interview and some of the things, like when you take 4 little pieces of things and add them together, we narrowed it down to maybe 20 or 30 people. And then eventually, just by doing background checks and Facebook and everything kind of matches. The other private investigator said, and like I said, we still want you to remain anonymous. And she said, okay. The private investigator said, everything was Jane Doe, and that's exactly the way it's going to remain, but we just have a few questions. And she said, okay. The other private investigator said, so you found what? You found a lawyer or you found something on Facebook like? And she said, I found something on Facebook for Ava Law Group, and they put me in touch with Tony Buzbee, and then that's how it went. The private investigator then said, okay, so that's who you contacted first. Did you ever meet him? And she said, yeah. The private investigator then said, okay, we're just double checking because I know he has a lot of people who work in his office. Jane Doe said, yeah, no, I met him. He flew me out to, and the private investigator interrupted and said Houston, and then she repeated Houston. The private investigator then said, okay, so you went and saw him there. The other private investigator said, did you go by yourself? And she said, yeah. And the private investigator said, okay. And the other private investigator said, did he give you money to pay for the trip, or did he just reimburse you? And she said, no, he paid for it. The other private investigator said he flew her out there. Then the other private investigator said, right, so he did pay. Okay, since the situation, have you been paid at all for what's going on? Now, when you first talked to him, was he promising you anything, or did he help you with your story, or you got your story on your own? Like, what was the initial meeting with him like? She said, the first time I met with him was in a coffee shop. The private investigator said, out here in Texas, and she said, in Houston. The private investigator then said, okay, so you met him, and did you go through each step, or did he just sit down and you just talked? Jane Doe said he talked about what was all going to go through and what had all happened. The private investigator then said, so something happened, or did he just tell you what happened? The Jane Doe said, no, he didn't tell me what happened. Something actually happened when I was 13. I ran away and I ended up there. The private investigator then said, but did it involve anybody that you named? She said it involved Jay-Z and Diddy, but not the other two. The private investigator then said, okay, so why did it now get dropped? And she said, because I was too scared to go forward with it. They told me he was threatening to off me. Jay-Z was threatening. The private investigator said, who told you that? The Jane Doe then said, they told me Jay-Z was threatening to off me. The private investigator said, who? The other one said, who told you that? And she said, the lawyers. The private investigator said, the lawyers did? Buzbee? She said, yeah. He said that there were threats against my life and that anything else could get me in a lot of trouble and that he could come after me. The private investigator said, well, I can almost promise you that that's not accurate. That's probably what the problem is. Then going forward, I think that they were facing a lot of repercussions from it. I think that they might have just tried to talk you out of just getting rid of the case. She said, okay. The private investigator said, so now I know you had military service. How come? What happened to the military service that you kind of left early? The Jane Doe said, I just got injured. Private investigator said, you got injured. We saw some of your Facebook stuff and said some of the issues you have now is from the military, all right? So as far as you're concerned, the whole story you gave is accurate. And the Jane Doe said, yes. Private investigator said they just talked you into dropping the case because now, well, I'm not going to say that they talked you into it, but they kind of told you that. The Jane Doe said, no, they talked me into dropping the case. The private investigator said, okay, and you were not planning on dropping the case? Did they ever promise you money? Or did they just say, we'll see what happens? Or Jane Doe said, well, they said that I would get a payout, but I already knew that that was not 100% accurate. The private investigator said, did you sign an agreement or anything, any kind of retainer, like when you were retained to handle the case, that would get like 50% or you would get 50%? And Jane Doe said, yes, it was. I did sign something like that. The private investigator said, okay, that they would get it. Okay. And then when they dropped it, or when you dropped it, did you have to pay any expenses or anything? Okay. The male private investigator said, no. Okay. The female private investigator said, so you haven't paid them anything and they haven't paid you anything. Okay. So you honestly believe, and I don't know the entirety of your story of what happened when you were 13, why you ran away and yada, yada, yada. But Jay-Z, they honestly, you feel like they SA'd you. Private investigator said, we don't know. And Jane Doe said, it was more Diddy, but Buzbee brought Jay-Z into it. The private investigator said, see, now, if you don't mind, can you explain that? Because that's kind of the... And the Jane Doe said, he asked if Jay-Z was there, and I said yes. The private investigator said, so when you originally sat down at the coffee shop, you told him that Diddy did something to you? The Jane Doe said yes, because it started out, it was only Diddy and blank, and then Jay-Z came in. The private investigator said, but not from your mouth? Jane Doe said, yeah. The private investigator said, he asked you about Jay-Z? And the Jane Doe said, yeah. The private investigator said, but Jay-Z was, you're saying he was definitely there, but he had no part in it. He was just, the Jane Doe said he was there. The private investigator said he was just there, but he didn't have anything to do with any SA towards you. It was strictly, Jane Doe says, yeah. The private investigator said, okay, and now we're talking about it was at a party or something like that, right? An after party. So he was just present at the party. Okay, so you only got into Jay-Z's name because he was asking you, and did he suggest that Jay-Z might have had a part in it? Jane Doe said he was the one that kind of pushed me towards going forward with him, with Jay-Z. The private investigator said, with Jay-Z, Buzbee did? The Jane Doe said, yeah. The private investigator said, do you know why? And Jane Doe said no. The private investigator said he never mentioned it. Did you ask? Like, you know, why do you keep harping on? Jane Doe said no. Private investigator said, why did you do the interview on NBC and who set that up? She said Tony did. Tony? Buzbee, and the Jane Doe responds, Buzbee. The private investigator says, Buzbee. Okay, so where did you do the interview? Jane Doe said, in Tony Buzbee's office in Houston. The private investigator said, okay, so he flew you out there again for that, or was it the same time? The Jane Doe said, no, it was the same time he flew me out there. And then the private investigator says he called NBC and he got them there, and the Jane Doe says, yeah. The private investigator said, okay, that's all right. Listen, we definitely appreciate that you're being honest because like you said, again, when it comes to like Jay-Z, we're kind of here, kind of on his behalf-ish, because if we believe that he said, I don't know what, I had no part of that. And if you were pushed into saying that, that's something that's kind of worthwhile to us. The private investigator said, yeah. Jane Doe said, you're here on Jay-Z's behalf. The private investigator said, not on his behalf. And the other private investigator said, indirectly, but Jay-Z had nothing to do with this, correct? And then Jane Doe said, right. The private investigator said, other than he was at the party that you were at, so I mean, he did not SA you. Jane Doe said no. And then the private investigator said, would you be willing to give us an affidavit to that effect? The other private investigator said, and from what we were told, if you do an affidavit saying that that is true, they will pretty much have said that they will remain keeping your name as Jane Doe all the way through. The other private investigator said, you will be a Jane Doe. The other private investigator then said, they're a little more upset with blank. They think that you're more of a victim. On that end of the case, they took advantage of you and kind of made you say things that maybe weren't accurate to make the case better. The other private investigator says, right, to get more money. And Jane Doe says, yeah. The private investigator then says, so if that's true, that's something we kind of, and the other private investigator said that we need to know. The private investigator then says, because again, I hate to say it, you have children, they have children also. If one was responsible, that's one thing. One was not responsible. His kids, his wife, his family, they're hearing that he might be responsible for something that nobody wants to be accused of if they didn't do it. Do you understand that? And Jane Doe said, yeah. I'm sure you can understand, and Jane Doe says yes again. The private investigator then said, nobody wants their kids thinking bad of them. The other private investigator said, right. So would you be willing to help us as far as the fact that the things you said about Jay-Z were not correct? The other private investigator said, we just want to set the record straight so that he's able to, so that. The other private investigator says, so that he can move on and this can get out of his, being accused of this because, if it didn't happen, correct? The Jane Doe says, you have a good day, guys. The private investigator said, are you sure? And the other private investigator yells out her name, come here, it's okay. The private investigator then says, I promise, we're not here to hurt you. We're not. And then the other private investigator said, we're going to try to help you. We're not doing this to hurt you. This is all to help you. Believe me. What's wrong? Tell me. Talk to me. The other private investigator then said, yeah, if you have concerns, tell us what they are and we'll see if we can. The other private investigator said, just talk to me. If Jay-Z didn't have anything to do with it, it's okay. But if he did, we need to know. I promise you, we're not going to hurt you. And like I said, we're going to keep your name out of it. You're going to be a Jane Doe. Private investigator said, we're just going to set the record straight. That's really the only thing we're here for. The other private investigator said, I promise. Jane Doe says, I just don't want him getting mad at me. Private investigator said, he's not. I don't know where these threats. That came from Buzbee. That never happened. Jay-Z never said anything like that. The Jane Doe said, but you're saying he found me and you guys are here because he found me. The private investigator said, I don't know that he found you. And the other private investigator said, I don't know if he found you. Like I said, we're going to keep your name as a Jane Doe. We're just independent hires. We just come to talk to you and try to set the record straight. That's all we're told to come here for. As long as you were honest and kept with it, they kind of said they were going to get a lawyer to come. And a lawyer has nothing to do with anything. Have you sign an affidavit, set the record straight, and keep you as a Jane Doe, just to kind of clear it out, clear the truth. The other private investigator said, right, we just want to know that Jay-Z he was there, but he had nothing to do with your SA. The other private investigator said, and that's all. We're not asking you to say nothing bad happened to you. We're not here to say that you're, just that. The private investigator said, yeah, and we're not dismissing the fact that something happened to you. That has nothing to do with it, but we just want to clarify that Jay-Z did not have anything to do with it and that he didn't SA you. Is that a fair assessment? And the Jane Doe says, yeah. Private investigator said that's all we need. That's all we want, and that's all we want to do is just ask you about that. If you're willing to sign an affidavit to the fact that Jay-Z had nothing to do with it. The other private investigator said, and that's all it would say. It's not going to say anything about anything else that happened to you that night, just that he was not a participant. And then they will go forward. It's because they have a problem with other folks now, because basically they're trying to make up things against their client. So they're going to look and go after them, and they can leave your name out of it as a Jane Doe with cooperation, because there's no reason to include you, because we do think you're kind of a victim. We think that they kind of took advantage of you. And the Jane Doe said, but how does this help me? The private investigator said, it keeps you anonymous, and to be honest, it sets the record straight. Like I said, I don't think it's necessarily fair that some of his kids think that he did something that he didn't do. And I'd say, you know, obviously he's very popular. A lot of people think that maybe he did something really horrible, and if he didn't, we want to straighten it out. The Jane Doe said, y'all have a nice afternoon. And the other private investigator yells out her name, can we call you? Whew, this Tony Buzbee and Jay-Z war is far from over, and it keeps getting crazier and crazier as time goes on. But y'all let me know what you guys think about all this in the comments.